very much. It's always a massive privilege to be asked to speak. I'm kind of gutted that I'm not staying for the drinks now, although I don't like whiskey either. That's blasphemy up here. Obviously, as a pirate, I only drink rum. But yeah, I'm really happy to be here and to talk about pirates. I was always told that you should start a speech with something a little bit unexpected, so here we go. This is me, aged 8, at my first pirate party, where I took the nautical theme a little bit loosely and went dressed as a mermaid. Kudos to my mum for this fabulous costume that she made with her Singer sewing machine, and also just letting me go out dressed like that, aged 8. I really remember this moment because I was adamant that I was not going to go dressed as a boy. Little did I know back then that there were female pirates, of course. I didn't know that. There is a serious point to this. In hindsight, I would say that I am the most pirate person at the party, because Be More Pirate is first and foremost about giving yourself permission to break a few rules. And of course, here I am, breaking a few rules, giving myself permission to be the most glamorous person at the party. Long may that continue. But it is a good place to start the conversation this morning about what it actually means to be a pirate. Because we grow up with this version of piracy, these kind of Disney loons and all the associations that go along with that they're violent and dangerous and lying, thieving criminals who are only out for themselves. And the truth, of course, as it often is a little bit more nuanced than that. And it is part of my personal ambition to change the cultural definition of what pirate is. The reality was probably a little bit more like this. In the late 1600s, at the dawn of what was called the golden age of piracy, there was a saying: those who would go to sea for pleasure would go to hell as a pastime. Life at sea was pretty brutal. The Navy was the biggest employer in Britain at the time, but 40% of sailors died on any voyage. So unsurprisingly, people weren't exactly queuing up unless it was an absolute last resort, and they would send press gangs around all the ports and the pubs in London and all the other cities to try and basically beat people on board. And then they over-recruited, and then that increased the cramped conditions and the disease, and it was a kind of chicken and egg situation going on. But the ones that did survive became highly skilled mariners, and they reached a bit of a tipping point, where they kind of looked around at the world and saw that they were doing the bidding of a self-serving establishment who were out plundering and exploiting the world, profiteering from international wars, and they certainly weren't benefiting ordinary people. And so they decided to rise up and start a bit of a rebellion. They realized that the game was rigged, and if they chose to play by these rules, they were always going to play to lose. These were the first pirates. And they were not a one-dimensional bunch, like the kind of types we see in things like Pirates of the Caribbean. They were far more interesting and far more diverse than that. Let me introduce to you some of the key players. Here we have Black Sam Bellamy, sometimes known as the Prince of Pirates or the Robin Hood of the Sea. So committed was he to social justice. He would give these rousing speeches in town squares where he would talk to wannabe pirates. In one of his most famous speeches, he said this: "They vilify us, the scoundrels do, when there is only this difference. They rob the poor under the cover of law, and we plunder the rich under the protection of our own courage." Unfortunately, Sam died aged 28. He was one of the youngest pirates to die, but he died very wealthy and with a huge legacy and a following. You probably haven't heard of Black Caesar either, one of the very many black pirate captains, originally an African tribal chief taken as a slave and then turned pirate. He was one of the key members of Blackbeard's crew. And in the latter half of the golden age of piracy, pirates were regularly freeing slave ships and bringing them on board, and they were working together as equals. This was the only place in the Western world at the time where you'd have seen the diversity of people working together. You might have heard of Anne Bonny, the most famous female pirate of them all. Originally from Ireland, her family moved to the north coast of America, where she fled and ran off to sea with another notorious pirate, Calico Jack Rackham. And they sailed the seven seas, and she created this reputation for being incredibly fierce and as brave as any men. But the interesting thing about Anne Bonny is this, and this is another picture of her. This was the picture that made it onto the front cover of the General History of Pirates, which was the volume about piracy that was circulating at the time. And it bears a striking resemblance to another painting, which you probably do know, Lady Liberty Leading the People by the French painter Delacroix, which hangs in the Louvre. Very, very similar. And interestingly, Delacroix was known to be fascinated with pirates. There's absolutely no way he wouldn't have seen this picture. And we know what Lady Liberty leading the people went on to inspire, not just Les Mis, the Statue of Liberty. Now, I'm not seriously saying that the Statue of Liberty is a pirate, although some historians have laid claim that there is a direct link here. What I am saying is that Anne Bonny rewrote the rules for what it meant to be a woman. She was a kind of proto-feminist. She changed what women were seen to be capable of at the time. And she earned, pirates the name that Shona said earlier, that they were the social revolutionaries of the 1700s, because piracy really was a bid for freedom above all else. And this is why. Pirates, on board a pirate ship, you saw the first form of real democracy. On board a pirate ship, everybody had equal say on all the decisions that were made. And so even if you were, it didn't matter where you came from. It was more democratic than ancient Greece, where only white men had the say. And you can imagine the scene at the time, the beginning of the golden age of piracy. Suddenly you're on board a ship with 80-odd, largely illiterate strangers, all carrying weapons. You've got to figure out a way to live and work together. And you've got to make it harmonious. You've got to try and outgun the navy. And so the new rules that they were creating were so important. Democracy was the first one. It was so important that everybody was able to contribute to the culture that they were creating together. They also had equal and transparent pay, because nothing causes conflict like money does. So everyone knew what everyone was getting. The leadership would only get 2 to 4 times more than the average crew member, which is arguably more progressive than some of the situations we see still today. They also put a lot of checks and balances on power, again, to provide a counterbalance to the kind of tyranny that they'd all experienced whilst in the Navy and on the merchant ships. So they pioneered what we now see as, in parliaments and governments all over the world, this form of dual governance, where the captain and the quartermaster were equals on board a pirate ship. The captain would be in charge of the strategy and the direction of sail, whereas the quartermaster was in charge of the crew. It was like the voice of the crew, was in charge of culture. So the quartermaster would typically look after things like the punishment and the money, the two things most likely to be abused by a captain. They created social insurance. So on a pirate ship, if you lost a leg or an eye in a battle, you would actually get compensation for your injury. And this, again, was kind of a strategic move. I'm not really going to lay claim to the fact that pirates were creating all of these things for moral reasons. It was more to do with the fact that they wanted to incentivize people to get involved in the battles. So we don't want to find anyone cowering below deck. And so you would get monetary compensation if you got injured. But I'd imagine that that also made people feel that their lives weren't expendable in the same way that they were in the Navy. And this one is probably the one that shocks people most. Pirates even had same-sex marriage. They had a legal and ritual ceremony to celebrate same-sex relationships that was so sophisticated, it even had an inheritance clause in it. So if your partner died, you'd get their share of the treasure that you'd accumulated. And it wasn't just internally that pirates were really, really progressive. You might at least think that they would go out and they would kill each other or be competitive for treasure and taking down other ships. But no, they were actually really collaborative. They worked together. So if they had to fight a big battle, they'd team up with other pirate crews, and then they'd scale right back down. So they were very agile, very networked, and they would retain their autonomy. So they didn't mirror this kind of command and control structure that we see so often in big organizations. They kind of knew that they were all on the same side, basically. And the way that they retained their autonomy as different crews and different captains was, of course, through the Jolly Roger, the skull and crossbones, arguably the world's first viral brand. Pirates knew that they could weaponize their reputation and their storytelling power to actually get into battle less. So if you saw the skull and crossbones on the horizon, you knew the tagline, surrender or die. And most of the time, people surrendered. They just handed over their goods. So pirates actually didn't have to get into battle. They just protected their resources. Arguably, pirates were the least violent people on the sea at the time, at least by frequency. Although I won't avoid the fact that when they were violent, they were really violent. But they weren't trying to start a fight, which I think really throws a grenade at our popular perception of the pirates. I hope this is starting to convince some of you that pirates were not the troublemakers we grew up thinking. They were, in fact, pioneers and innovators. I'm sure there's still some skeptics in the room. And the interesting thing is, they didn't actually set out to try and change the world. They only wanted to change their world. They didn't, set out with this lofty ambition and plan to do good. They simply all started from their own personal point of motivation. And this is a really important point about how lasting change can happen. And all of this glorious history is, of course, captured in the book, Be More Pirates, which is written by my co-pirate and colleague Sam, who's looking uncharacteristically grumpy in this picture. He's really not grumpy, he's lovely and very optimistic. But truth be told, when I first read Be More Pirate, well, I picked it up, read 2 or 3 pages, and then pretty much put it right back down, or I kind of threw it across the room, because I just really didn't buy it. I've read a lot of books with similarly inspirational titles about how to change the world, and I thought, why is this going to be any different? This just looks like good marketing to me. I was in a place of quite a lot of skepticism at the time. I'd been working in a think tank for 7 years, doing a lot of thinking and talking, and truth be told, I just didn't believe it. I'd gotten to the point where I thought, I never want to hear the word innovation or innovative ever again. I've seen enough well-crafted reports and been through enough strategic reviews, and I just didn't believe that real change was possible. It felt like we were, that common phrase of kind of tinkering with the deck chairs on the Titanic. And with everyone's best intentions, we were talking about change. But when I zoomed out and looked at the bigger picture and things like climate change, social inequality, and democracy, we weren't really doing that much at all. And I began to believe that actually we were far more invested in protecting the status quo than fighting against it. So I brought all of that lovely cynicism straight to Sam's doorstep. He'd advertised for a right-hand pirate. That was genuinely the job. And it was really, as Shona said, to move the book into a kind of community or a network or a social movement of some kind. But I said quite directly to him, is your book more style over substance? Who are your community? Do you even know? And are you just another leader who wants to gain followers? Probably a little bit full on now I think about it. But when he replied, it really surprised me. He just said, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. And I'd never seen so much honesty and transparency in someone I considered to be a leader or someone of influence. So that made me trust him a lot more. What he did say was, I don't know, but I'm receiving a lot of messages from people all over the world talking about how this book has influenced them to make real change. Messages like this. Ahoy, Sam. I want you to know how much your book influenced me. Reading this led me to handing in my 1 month's notice. This guy attached his resignation letter. That very evening, thanks for putting my priorities in check, I needed reminding I'm breaking rules and creating some scary but necessary change. And he was like, this feels like a lot of responsibility. People are actually doing things. And so I started to explore these messages, and they were coming from everywhere, from healthcare, education, entrepreneurs, individuals, business leaders, public sector, private sector. And I started to ask them, what is it about this book that is resonating so much? What kind of rules are we talking about breaking here? What are the new rules that you're creating, and why is this taking hold? And so I took the job, right-hand pirate, and embarked on an adventure with Sam. And I never really thought that it would become a new book at all, because as you've just seen, I'm quite skeptical about books about change. But there was so much substance in it, and there was so much wisdom to share from this wonderful community of people. One of the first things that they really taught me was actually about the role of storytelling and the power of storytelling in all of this, which I think, if I'm honest, is still very, very undervalued in a lot of sectors. I could see from the pirates, the modern pirates, that just by calling themselves pirate, just by stepping into that avatar kind of gave them a disguise, like a new power in the language of rule-breaking and rebellion and mutiny. It gave them the power and the permission to just do things differently. And I think, as I said, we undervalue it. We tend to resort to information and data when we're trying to build a case to try and influence people or make real change. But we can see from all the climate action that information alone is not enough. It's not going to be enough. Change happens when you get people to feel something. And that was what Be More Pirate was doing for our community. I also realized that people would be more encouraged to make change when they could see other people like themselves doing it. It's really great to, talk about the examples provided by people like Greta Thunberg, but that's not our everyday. And I wanted to show how you can make bold moves, in everyday teams. And I hope that the book is full of relatable case studies. The other thing the pirates told me, what showed me, was that they could see such a clear parallel between where the historic pirates sat in the 1700s on the precipice of the Industrial Revolution and where we stand today on the precipice of a net zero revolution, we hope. And the fact that at the moment where we stand is with all these inherited norms and rules and systems from the 20th century that so badly need updating. They're starting to really fail us. And then we've had this pandemic, which has put a huge fracture in the concept of normal. But we kind of know that new normal isn't going to cut it. We don't really know what else to grasp onto yet. And there is quite a specific pirate way of navigating through storms and uncertainty, and I'm really sorry if this GIF makes you feel a bit nauseous, because sometimes it does to me. It's a difference between navigating using a compass and using a map. So a map is certain terrain. You're at point A, you've got to get to point B, you can kind of see the road in between, you can see some milestones you've got to hit to get there, and you can kind of follow the plan. A compass is quite different. A compass doesn't have a defined destination. It only gives you a direction of travel. And it has reference points that you can refer to and go back to, no matter how much the landscape around you changes. And your compass points are things like your values, your personal skills and your strengths, your personal motivation, your intuition. And I can tell you, because I personally adopt this philosophy myself and have done since I've embarked on this Be More Pirate journey, that navigating using a compass makes storms a lot less scary. And so what I really want to share with you today is some things from our Be More Pirate community that I use to navigate by. You could call it like a pirate code. This is the idea of a compass is basically like a pirate code, but except they used it in teams. The pirate code, the original pirate code, was all those new rules that I explained to you at the beginning, the equal pay, the democracy. It was a series of 5 to 10 rules that everybody in the crew knew inside out that they could use to make decisions, no matter what happened, no matter what situation they found themselves in. The code was like the anchor, and it was what created very high levels of trust and transparency and accountability inside a team. And it's not the same as having a set of brand values that you stick on a website or you put in a document and then you shove in a drawer and you don't look at it for a year. A code is something that is lived and expressed every single day. It's about closing the gap between your intention and your action, and it's about really translating those values into day-to-day behaviors and actions. And of course, we got many people from the community sending us their own pirate codes and explaining how they'd done it. So yeah, what I want to share with you is a little bit about the ideas that I and the Be More Pirate community use to navigate. And I think they can apply to every sector. I don't think they're sector-specific at all. And I hope that some of it feels practical to you, that you can take away and actually use. The first one is to fundamentally reframe the idea of rebellion, that rebellion is a responsibility. And we kind of know this. We know that sometimes doing the wrong thing is actually the right thing to do. That's why we put up statues of rule breakers. This is Millicent Fawcett, of course, who is the leader of the suffragettes movement, has a statue in Parliament Square. And Millicent, of course, saw into the future and could see that women should have the vote. But at the time, she was ostracized and denigrated as a troublemaker. Seems utterly ludicrous now. So we know that there is a moment in time when doing the wrong thing is the right thing. But those people might not be so ostracized in the moment if we actually reframed this and took a different perspective on what it means to challenge the status quo. When I was doing some research into the concept of rule breaking in the last couple of years, I came across this term, intelligent disobedience. And it's a phrase that comes from guide dogs. So when you train a guide dog, you first train it to be obedient, to listen to its human, take instructions as it should. And then it goes through a period of training where it's trained to be deliberately disobedient, or to understand at what point it needs to listen to its own instincts and its own judgment in order to keep the human safe. It's critical that it does this. Humans don't really have any such training. Even though we know that there are moments when we do need to listen to our judgment and our instincts, we are, and I'm generalizing slightly, we are largely told to follow rules. And this comes from when we're very young and we're at school. We have a system of reward and punishment for following the rules. And this matters a lot because when we become adults, we are somewhat conditioned. And the fear that we have for breaking the rules, it doesn't just live in our brains, it lives in our bodies, it's in our nervous systems. So even though there can be moments when you know you should be challenging something and you know that what's being done is not the right thing, it can feel very scary to put your hand up and say, I disagree, or I'm not doing that. And this is really, really important because the research shows that particularly in high-risk environments like medicine and the military, it's absolutely essential that people feel confident enough to challenge figures of authority, to say, I have different information, So what I really fundamentally believe about this is that we all need training. We need to practice this. It is a practice. It gets better with repetition. We need to be able to confidently and assertively challenge the status quo in particular moments. And when I say this, I mean constructively challenge, because what sometimes happens is that you get an outburst of frustration or you suddenly find the courage, and all you get met with is defensive reactions. We kind of have a bit of a call-out culture now. And that's not what we want to get to. We want to be able to practice this so that it lands, so that we actually influence the outcome. So practicing intelligent disobedience. However, being a pirate is as much about rule-making as it is about rule-breaking. The pirate rebellion was inherently a creative one as well. So another thing that I've learned is about making rules, how you make the rules, what kind of rules. And I learned this from a really amazing guy called Professor Andrew Sharman. Simple rules are safer. Andrew is the president of the Institution of Occupational Safety and Health, which is probably the last place that I ever expected to find pirates. I would have imagined that they were very adamant around following the rules. But Andrew does count himself as one of our crew. And what he said to me was this. Simple rules are safer. We like to create lots of complicated policies, and we like to create lots and lots of instructions because it gives the illusion of safety. But actually what you need, simple rules are safer counterintuitively, because if you create things to be too complicated, A, people take shortcuts, that's just human nature, and B, when you have simpler rules, you allow that room for interpretation and judgment. And interpretation and judgment makes people stay more vigilant, and vigilance is what creates safety. So he taught me a lot about, and that's basically the idea of a pirate code, having a set of more simple principles that you can adhere to, and you allow people to somewhat interpret. Another really unexpected place that we found pirates, alongside health and safety, was health and social care. Again, would have expected the levels of risk to not see them embrace piracy, but one of the first things that they taught me about making rules was this: bad rules are made when they're made without the people that they are for. And that was happening all over the place in health and social care. Whether you're designing new services, campaigns, products, they weren't getting the right information feeding in because they were excluding the people who were on the receiving end of those services. So we've got to work a lot harder at breaking down organisational silos on that front. And this came up actually in the last year while I was doing a project with a big housing association, and they hired me to help them improve their relationship with local residents and tenants and the communities, and take a Be More Pirate approach to it. They're like, how can we look at this differently? And so we started asking some different questions, flipping assumptions. One thing was this. We asked, what if every single person in this organisation spent dedicated time every month inside the communities, talking to tenants and residents with no agenda other than to listen, no tasks to complete, no risk assessments to do, just to listen? How would that change what services look like? And how would that change the relationship over the long term, even though I know it's going to feel very inefficient in the short term? Another question we asked was, what would it look like if we stopped trying to reduce the amount of complaints we get from tenants? What if we celebrated them? What if we saw them as a disguised desire for more connection and more engagement? What if we saw opportunity in the resistance there? What would that look like? And that one was a bit more of an uncomfortable one, because I was, who wants to be held up a mirror to complaints and criticism? Nobody. But I was quite deliberately trying to navigate them towards what they were fearing the most, because that was the thing that was going to help them through this big pandemic storm as well. And that's another key principle in our code. Always head towards the edges of the map. Because at the edges of the map, there are two things: dragons and treasure, fear and opportunity. In the darkness, in the spaces at the edges, the unknown, unfamiliar, is where you find the new opportunity. And you cannot think that you're going to get real creativity and innovation without that. And I really hate that innovation is, posited to us as shiny apps. It's actually just discovery. It's all about discovery, and it's a mindset. It's not a thing. So heading towards the edges of the map. And I'm going to give you an example from our book to maybe make this feel a little bit more concrete. I was very lucky to do some work with the cancer charity Macmillan, and I think this is a great example because cancer touches so many of our lives. Fabulous team down in London who'd done a really good job engaging with and creating a cancer community with lots of different types of people who'd experienced cancer in one way or another. And then one day, a young woman came to them and asked a question. This young woman, Sarah, was only 28, and she'd just recovered from Hodgkin's lymphoma. And she said, the one thing that I cannot get information about is sex. Sex after cancer. She's like, I can get information about fertility, but not sex just for sex sake. And nobody wants to talk about it. The nurses won't give me any information. They don't even know where to signpost me. And she said, can we explore this? And so the team did a sort of investigation, surveyed the rest of their community and said, is this something we want to talk about? And the resounding answer was yes, we do. It feels so taboo, but yeah, we want to talk about this. It so affects our relationship with our bodies and our families. And so they held a sex and cancer workshop inside a sex shop, which I've put up here. And yes, I'm repeating it, perhaps it's a little bit uncomfortable, but that's the point. And it was, and I wasn't there, but by all accounts, an incredibly moving and transformative experience for them. They were finally able to just talk about something that they hadn't been able to previously. And in this story, there are sort of three things I'd say to you about how to get off the edges of the map that this exemplifies. One, think about what is at the edges for you. What is the subject that is a taboo, that is being swept underneath the rug? And it probably won't, in this context be sex, but it might be, we're not being realistic about the budget here, we're not realistic about the timeline. What are we kind of smoothing over and covering up? Who is at the edges for you? Who do you not engage with? What kind of people have you never spoken to? Could they give you a different perspective on a problem? Too often we stay in our bubbles when it comes to people, and in this case, Sarah was at the edges of that cancer community because she was young, and young people were not really being acknowledged. Their experience of cancer was quite different. And where is at the edges for you? What kind of spaces and places could you go into that could make you look at something differently? They did this in a sex shop, this specific one actually, on purpose, because the different environment allowed people to talk about it differently. Getting out of a clinical setting was so critical. Environment has such a big impact on our mindset. We don't often acknowledge it. So getting out of your usual places and spaces is a really good way to get off the edges. The final thing I want to share is about action. Small, bold actions. It's good to talk about all of this stuff and ask difficult questions, but really we've got to act. As we've heard, there's not much time on a lot of the really big pressing issues. And when I started doing Be More Pirate workshops with Sam, we came across a problem. There was something that was very, very clearly happening when we would ask people to create some new rules for their company or their team. Especially in rooms of really smart and ambitious people, they would go too big. So they would say things like, right, we're going to rewrite the rules, we're going to eradicate single-use plastic from our organization, or we're going to create a whole new program for our customers. And given all the previous conversation we'd had about how overwhelmed they were by their workloads and the busyness that we all kind of experience day to day, I knew it wasn't going to happen. I was like, there's a mismatch here. What's going to actually happen is that all the momentum and excitement that we've built up about being a pirate today is going to die. It's going to die tomorrow when they get back to their day-to-day grind. And that's a really, really important thing, because the biggest barrier to change is the collective belief that change is impossible, or at least very difficult. And so it was going to compound that belief if they didn't get at least something done. So we were asking the wrong question. The question to ask was, what is the small, bold action that you can take in the next week that will actually move the needle on the bigger vision or ambition? What could you do that is logistically easy to accomplish, so it doesn't involve loads of people, you don't need loads of sign-off, is bold, so it's got to be something that's outside of your norm. It's not just a habit creation, it's doing something that feels a bit uncomfortable to you, but not so much that you take a huge risk or burn out, because the research shows that if you take a big risk straight away and it doesn't work, you'll never do it again. So that wasn't the point. It was to test, it's to flex the muscle a little bit. And I'll give you one quick example of this, and this comes from a big local authority in England, one of the biggest cities. I'm not going to mention who they are. And the small crew within this local authority decided to test out a small, bold action to change email culture, which might not seem like a big thing, but it was something that they agreed upon needed to change. It was dragging everybody's energy down, and it wasn't working. So they agreed upon 4 new rules for email culture. Thinking before I can email, can I have a conversation instead? Taking protected time away from email to focus on the big stuff that makes the biggest difference. Checking my tone, am I structuring it in a way I'd be pleased to receive? And if it's bad news, I will not deliver it by email. But the bold action was that they actually made this their email signature. So every time they sent an email, they reinforced the message. And that's another really important point about a small, bold action. If you can make it repeatable, all the better. And the important thing to know about this team and this crew is that they were a crew. It wasn't just one person doing this. They had taken the time to get out of the office, go down to the cafe down the road, meet on a regular basis to discuss what kind of rules they might want to break and what kind of rules they might want to rewrite. They'd shared a lot of vulnerabilities around the frustrations that they were feeling together. So don't try and do this alone. Again, the popular perception of pirates is that they are lone rebels, that they are these kind of lone rangers out on the sea causing havoc for havoc's sake. But actually a pirate never existed outside of a crew, really. So find your crew, find the people that you can work together with, because there is the evidence that shows that small groups are the things that change the world. And the final thing I want to say is, it doesn't matter if your small, bold action doesn't work the first time, if it sort of doesn't elicit the results you'd perhaps hoped. The real point of it is that you experience the feeling of taking a risk, that you take a chance upon yourself in some way. What matters is that you do something, because no one is coming to save you. And it's called Be More Pirate for a reason, not Be a Pirate, because we all start in a different place. Risk-taking is subjective. We all have a different tolerance for risk. We're all coming from different places. We have different experiences, privilege, cultures. So don't judge other people's small, bold action by what you think is risky or not risky. Instead, just look inwards and ask where you could give yourself more permission to do something. Being a more pirate should be the best version of yourself. It should be taking a little bit more courage and acting upon what you believe in, because God knows the world needs more of that right now. Thank you.